The rain had been falling for hours when the knock came at 12:47 in the morning. Darius Cole opened the door of his small apartment in East Baltimore, still wearing the clothes he'd fallen asleep in while grading his daughter's homework. The fluorescent light from the hallway spilled into the darkness behind him, and for a moment, he didn't recognize the woman standing there. Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford Capital Partners. Barefoot. Her designer dress soaked through, clinging to her frame like a second skin that cost more than his monthly rent. Her eyes held something he had never seen in 6 years of working 3 floors beneath her office. Fear. Behind him, small footsteps. His daughter Zoe appeared 7 years old and still rubbing sleep from her eyes. She pressed herself against his back, peering around him at the stranger in the doorway. Victoria's breath caught when she saw the child, and again when she looked back at Darius and found no submission in his gaze. No scramble to accommodate, just a man standing in his own doorway waiting. The rain kept falling. Nobody moved. In the offices of Ashford Capital Partners, Darius Cole existed in a particular kind of visibility, the kind that made him seen and unseen at the same time. He was the only black financial analyst on the 17th floor, a fact that colored every interaction in ways both obvious and imperceptible. His credentials were impeccable. MBA from Howard, 5 years at Goldman before this. Numbers that spoke for themselves, except they never quite did. Every morning he badged in at the lobby turnstile like everyone else. But unlike everyone else, security occasionally asked to see his badge twice, sometimes 3 times. Not every day, just often enough to establish a pattern. Often enough that he'd learned to keep his ID visible at all times, clipped to his jacket pocket where it couldn't be missed. The small adjustment had become automatic, something he no longer thought about consciously. His body remembered even when his mind tried to forget. The 17th floor had its own rhythms, its own unspoken rules. When Darius spoke in meetings, colleagues would nod along, then repeat his points minutes later as if they'd originated them. When he walked to the coffee station, conversations would pause. Not stop entirely, just pause. A half-beat of awareness. He had learned to read these pauses the way sailors read weather. Some days they meant nothing. Other days they meant everything. His supervisor, a man named Bennett Henderson, who had never quite learned to pronounce Darius's last name correctly, had a habit of speaking more slowly when addressing him. Not dramatically, not enough to call out. Just a slight deceleration, an unconscious adjustment, as if Darius might need extra time to process information he'd mastered years before Henderson ever arrived at the firm. The other analysts treated him with careful politeness. They invited him to lunch occasionally, always to the same place. A Thai restaurant on the corner that had become somehow designated as the appropriate venue for including him. They asked about his weekend, his daughter. Never his opinion on the quarterly projections they discussed freely among themselves. The courtesy was genuine. So was the distance. There were moments that cut deeper than others. The time a client assumed he was there to refill the water glasses. The meeting where his analysis was attributed to a colleague who hadn't contributed a single data point. The elevator rides where women clutched their purses a little tighter, a gesture so small it could be imagined, except it happened too often to be imagination. He had learned not to react. Reaction was its own trap, a way of confirming whatever narrative had already been written. So he did his work. He exceeded every metric. He arrived early and left late and never gave anyone a reason to question his commitment. At home, in the quiet hours after Zoe had gone to bed, he sometimes wondered what all that discipline was building toward. The promotions came slowly, always with explanations that sounded reasonable in isolation, but formed a pattern when viewed together. He was being groomed for leadership, they said. These things took time. Meanwhile, younger analysts who looked like Henderson moved up the ladder with a speed that defied the same explanations. 3 years ago, there had been a meeting that changed something, the Mercer Industries deal. Everyone remembered the acquisition that had nearly destroyed Ashford Capital. Regulatory issues, hidden liabilities, a due diligence failure that had cost the company $800 million and almost cost Victoria Ashford her position. The board had wanted her head. They were in a room full of lawyers and accountants and executives, all of them looking for someone to blame. And Victoria was the obvious target. Darius had been there as a junior analyst brought in to present numbers he'd compiled on the failed deal. He had expected to deliver his findings and disappear. That wasn't what happened. Everyone in that room was telling Victoria what she wanted to hear, that it wasn't her fault, that the market was unpredictable, that they couldn't have known. The careful diplomacy filled the conference room like smoke obscuring everything. Then Darius had spoken, his voice cutting through it all. The data showed warning signs. We missed them because no one wanted to be the person who slowed down the deal. The room had gone silent. He'd said it directly to her in a room full of people who looked nothing like him. And when she pushed back when she questioned his analysis, he didn't backtrack. He didn't apologize. Are you sure her challenge had been sharp and public? His response measured but unmoving. I'm sure. Would you stake your position on it? He had looked at her, then really looked at her. I'd stake whatever you want. But it wouldn't change the numbers. Everyone else in that room had looked at the table when Victoria talked, looked at their notes, looked anywhere but at her. But Darius had met her eyes, and she had seen something in that moment that made her pause. Say that again. Say it while you look at me. I'm sure. The numbers don't lie. Victoria had used his analysis to restructure the deal to negotiate better terms to save Ashford Capital from collapse. Darius had received no credit, no promotion, no acknowledgement. He had simply returned to his desk and continued his work. But Victoria had remembered, had filed away his name, his face, the way he looked at her when he told the truth. Now she stood in his doorway, and the two worlds that Darius had kept separate were suddenly impossibly occupying the same space. He stepped back to let her in. What else could he do? Whatever had brought the CEO of his company to his door at this hour barefoot and terrified, it wasn't something that could be handled in a hallway. The apartment was small. He saw her register this immediately, her eyes sweeping over the second-hand furniture, the books stacked on every available surface, the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator. There was nothing here to impress anyone. It was simply a home, functional and warm and utterly ordinary. He retrieved a towel from the bathroom, handed it to her without ceremony. She took it, pressed it against her face for a moment. When she lowered it, mascara had smeared across the white cotton, a dark stain spreading like evidence. The kitchen was 3 steps away. He filled a kettle, set it on the stove, found 2 mugs that matched well enough. These were the motions of hospitality, the rituals that didn't require thought. They filled the silence while she collected herself. Zoe had followed them, standing in the kitchen doorway with her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. She watched Victoria with open curiosity. No fear, no judgment, just the pure attention of a child encountering something new. You're cold. It wasn't a question. Victoria nodded anyway. He turned up the thermostat. The baseboard heaters clicked on, filling the room with a low hum that seemed to settle something in the air. Outside, the rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows, a rhythm that had been building all evening and showed no signs of stopping. Victoria sat on the edge of his couch like she might need to leave at any moment. Her hands were shaking slightly, a tremor she couldn't quite control. She seemed smaller here, stripped of the corner office and the tailored suits and the army of assistants who anticipated her every need. Just a woman wet and frightened sitting in a stranger's living room. Except Darius wasn't quite a stranger. That was the strange part. She had come here deliberately, had sought out his address, somehow had navigated through the company's HR files or asked the right person the right question, had travelled across the city in the middle of a storm to knock on his specific door. There was a reason for that. There had to be. But he didn't ask. Not yet. The kettle whistled a sharp sound that cut through the quiet. He poured water over tea bags, added honey to 1 mug, because he remembered she took her coffee sweet in meetings. A small detail filed away unconsciously, now suddenly relevant. She accepted the tea with both hands, wrapping her fingers around the warmth like it was something precious. When she looked up at him, he didn't look away. This was perhaps the thing that surprised her most. In 6 years of walking past him in hallways, of sitting across from him in conference rooms, of occupying the same building while inhabiting entirely different worlds, she had never seen Darius Cole look at her directly. He was always appropriate, always professional, always slightly angled away, as if direct eye contact might be misinterpreted. Now he stood in his own kitchen in his own home, and he looked at her the way one adult looks at another, without deference, without calculation, without fear. She wasn't sure anyone had looked at her that way in years. Thank you. The words came out rough, inadequate for everything they were trying to carry. He nodded, sat down in the chair across from her, leaving appropriate distance between them. Zoe climbed into his lap, still watching Victoria with those serious eyes that seemed to see more than a 7-year-old should. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a waiting silence, patient and unhurried. Darius was giving her space to find her own words, her own timing, not pushing, not retreating, just present. Victoria Ashford took a breath, and for the first time in hours, she felt it fill her lungs completely. Zoe studied the woman on the couch for a long time. The quiet stretched out, filled only by the sound of rain and the occasional creak of the old building settling into the night. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the absolute certainty that only children possess. You look sad inside. Victoria's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Children had a way of saying things that adults spent entire careers learning to avoid cutting through pretense with the precision of a scalpel. Darius started to redirect his daughter, the parental instinct to smooth over to apologize for childish bluntness. But something in Victoria's face stopped him. She was staring at Zoe with an expression he couldn't quite name. Surprise, yes. But something else underneath. Something cracking. I am. Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. The admission dragged from somewhere deep. I am sad inside. Zoe nodded, as if this confirmed what she already knew. She slid off her father's lap and padded toward the kitchen, her rabbit dragging behind her on the worn carpet. When you're sad, she announced over her shoulder, you need hot chocolate with the little marshmallows. The big ones don't melt right. She disappeared around the corner. Cabinet doors opened and closed. Darius watched his daughter move through the kitchen with the confidence of someone performing a familiar ritual, one she had executed countless times before for reasons he was only now beginning to understand. She does this, he said quietly. When someone is upset, she makes them hot chocolate. Victoria's jaw tightened. She was fighting something, struggling against the dissolution of armor she'd worn for so long. It had become part of her skeleton. The corporate composure she maintained every day, the layers of control that allowed her to walk into boardrooms and command millions, they were threatening to slip. And Victoria Ashford did not slip. Not in negotiations, not in crisis, not ever. But a 7-year-old had asked about her sadness without any agenda, without wanting anything from her, without calculating the advantage. The simplicity of it was undoing her in a way that no hostile takeover or market crash ever could. A tear slid down her cheek. Then another. The dam breaking with a silence that was somehow louder than any sob could have been. Darius didn't move to comfort her. That wasn't his place, and he understood boundaries in a way that went beyond social convention. He simply remained where he was witnessing without intruding, offering the gift of being seen without being judged. Zoe returned with a mug that was slightly too full marshmallows bobbing on the surface like tiny life rafts. She walked carefully, her tongue poking out in concentration, the universal expression of children trying very hard to do something important. She set it on the coffee table in front of Victoria with the solemnity of someone presenting a treasure. You have to wait. It's really hot, but the waiting is part of it. Victoria looked at the hot chocolate, then at the child who had made it, then at the man who had raised her. The tears were coming freely now, but she wasn't sobbing. It was a quiet release, almost peaceful, like pressure finally finding its way out after being contained too long. No one at Ashford Capital had ever seen Victoria cry. No one in her family, for that matter. She had been trained from childhood to process emotion privately, to present a composed face to the world regardless of what churned beneath. Vulnerability was weakness. Weakness was exploited. These were the rules she had learned young and followed religiously. But this wasn't weakness. This was something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for yet. Zoe climbed onto the couch beside her, leaving a respectful gap between them. She didn't touch Victoria, didn't crowd her, just sat there small and solid and present in a way that required nothing from the person next to her. My mum went away when I was little. Zoe's voice was matter-of-fact, carrying information without seeking pity. I don't remember her very much, but Daddy says it's okay to be sad about people, even if you don't remember them. Darius's throat tightened. Sarah had died when Zoe was 2. Cancer that moved too fast took too much. He rarely talked about it, even with Zoe. But his daughter had absorbed something from him anyway, some understanding about grief and presence, and the things that didn't require words to be real. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The gesture was unpracticed, almost clumsy, like someone rediscovering a basic human motion. She looked at Zoe with something approaching wonder, as if she'd never encountered anything quite like this child before. You're very kind. Zoe shrugged the compliment sliding off her shoulders with the ease of someone who didn't think kindness was remarkable. Daddy says kind is just paying attention. She pointed at the hot chocolate. You should drink it now. The marshmallows are almost melted. Victoria picked up the mug, took a sip. The sweetness hit her tongue, too much sugar, the kind of flavor profile a child would create without understanding restraint or balance. She drank more anyway, letting the warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the cold that had settled there over the past few hours. Across the room, Darius watched his daughter do what he couldn't, what no adult could, really. She had looked at Victoria Ashford and seen not a CEO, not a powerful woman, not a threat or an opportunity, just a person who was sad inside. And she had responded the only way she knew how, with marshmallows and presents and the uncomplicated grace of a child who hadn't yet learned that some people were supposed to be treated differently than others. Something shifted in the room. Darius couldn't have named it, couldn't have pointed to the exact moment it changed, but the air felt different, lighter, like a window had been opened somewhere, letting in fresh air after years of staleness. Victoria set down the empty mug. The tears had stopped leaving her face, cleaned of the last remnants of mascara, stripped down to something raw and honest. When she looked at Darius now, she looked like someone who had been given permission to be human again, even if only for a moment. "Thank you," she directed it at both of them. "For this." Zoe yawned, the drama of the evening finally catching up with her small body. Her eyes were starting to droop, the fierce alertness fading into the softness of approaching sleep. "Time for bed, little one." Darius stood, and his daughter didn't argue. She slid off the couch, retrieved her rabbit from where it had fallen, and paused in front of Victoria. Her next words came with the casual generosity that children offer so easily. "You can stay. The couch is pretty comfortable. Daddy sleeps on it sometimes when he falls asleep reading." Then she was gone, padding down the hallway to her room, her small shadow disappearing into the darkness beyond the kitchen light. Victoria looked at Darius. He looked back, and in that exchange something was understood without being spoken. "Stay. It's late. The couch is yours." She nodded, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something in her face relaxed, the constant vigilance easing just slightly. It took her several minutes to begin. Darius had given her blankets, a pillow had retreated to the doorway of the kitchen to give her space while still being present. The apartment had grown quiet, except for the rain, which had settled into a steady rhythm that sounded almost like conversation. 3 years ago, there was a deal. Her voice cut through the quiet, steady, now clinical, almost like she was presenting findings in a boardroom. The Mercer Industries acquisition. Everyone remembered it, she said, though her tone suggested she wished they didn't. The regulatory issues, the hidden liabilities, the due diligence failure that had nearly destroyed everything she'd built. The board wanted my head. We were in a room full of lawyers and accountants and executives, all of them looking for someone to blame, and I was the obvious target. Darius nodded but said nothing, letting her words fill the space between them. "You were there. Do you remember?" He did. A junior analyst brought in to present numbers, expecting to deliver his findings, and disappear back into the machinery of the 17th floor. That wasn't what happened. Everyone in that room was telling me what I wanted to hear. That it wasn't my fault, that the market was unpredictable, that we couldn't have known. She paused, and in that pause, Darius heard all the things she wasn't saying, the weight of being surrounded by people who would rather comfort than correct. Except you. The memory came back to him now with perfect clarity. The polished wood table, the nervous energy crackling through the air, the careful diplomacy, and his own voice cutting through it all, clear and unequivocal. "I said the data showed warning signs. I said we missed them because no one wanted to be the person who slowed down the deal." Victoria nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she needed to hear again. "You said it directly to me in a room full of people who looked nothing like you. And when I pushed back, when I questioned your analysis, you didn't backtrack. You didn't apologize." The memory sharpened details emerging like photographs developing in a darkroom. Her challenge sharp and public, designed to test whether he really believed what he was saying or was just reading from prepared remarks. His response measured but unmoving, refusing to give ground even when every survival instinct screamed at him to defer. "You asked if I was sure. I said I was sure. You asked if I would stake my position on it. I said I would stake whatever you wanted, but it wouldn't change the numbers." Victoria almost smiled, the first hint of something other than fear or sadness crossing her face. Everyone else looked at the table when I talked, looked at their notes, looked anywhere but at me. She met his eyes, and in that moment the distance between CEO and analyst dissolved entirely. "You looked at me. You said it again, looking right at me. Say that again."
"Say it while you look at me." "And you did. And I knew you were telling the truth. That meeting had been a turning point for the company, though. Darius had never fully understood his role in it. Victoria had used his analysis to restructure the deal, to negotiate better terms, to save Ashford Capital from the collapse that had seemed inevitable. He had received no credit, no promotion, no acknowledgement. He had simply returned to his desk and continued his work another day, in a career built on being simultaneously visible and invisible. Tonight her voice wavered slightly, the clinical tone cracking just enough to let emotion through. "Tonight, I found out my brother is trying to take the company. He's been building a coalition on the board for months. I didn't see it. I trusted him." The betrayal in her voice was raw, unfiltered.
Family cut deepest, because family was supposed to be the one place where trust didn't require constant vigilance, where you could lower your guard without calculating the cost. I left a dinner party without my shoes, got in my car and drove. I didn't know where I was going. And then I was here. She looked around the small apartment as if seeing it clearly for the first time, taking in the modest furnishings, the lived-in quality of a space that had never tried to be anything other than a home. I came here because 3 years ago, you were the only person who told me the truth when it mattered. She paused, and in that pause the entire foundation of her visit became clear. I came here because I remembered your eyes. Darius absorbed this, the weight of being remembered for a moment. He had almost forgotten himself, a moment that had defined something for her while barely registering for him. Outside, the rain continued to fall, relentless and patient. Inside, the silence held both of them, gently making space for truth without demanding anything in return. He didn't cross the room to comfort her. He didn't offer solutions or advice or the false reassurance of easy words. He simply let her truth exist between them, witnessed and unhurried, validated by nothing more than his presence and his willingness to listen. And Victoria Ashford, who had not allowed herself to be vulnerable in front of another person in longer than she could remember, felt something in her chest finally begin to unknot. The apartment settled into darkness. Zoe was asleep, her door slightly ajar the way she liked it, letting in just enough light from the hallway to keep the shadows at bay. Darius sat in his bedroom, the door open, listening to the old building's familiar sounds, the pipes creaking, the floor settling, the rain against the windows like fingers tapping out messages in code. From the living room came a different sound, muffled, almost imperceptible. Crying. Not the quiet tears from earlier, but something deeper, waves of release that Victoria had probably held back for months, maybe years. The kind of crying that comes when you're finally somewhere safe enough to fall apart. He stood, moved to his doorway and stopped. The crying continued, soft and broken and utterly human. Every instinct told him to go to her, to offer comfort, human presence, the simple kindness of not letting someone cry alone in a stranger's apartment. But he understood something about this moment that went beyond instinct. He was a black man. She was a white woman. She was his CEO. He was her subordinate. She was alone in his apartment in the middle of the night, vulnerable and emotional, and temporarily without the armor that usually protected her from the world. Any version of this story that went wrong would not go wrong equally for both of them. The narrative that would be constructed, the assumptions that would be made, the conclusions that would be drawn, he knew exactly how that math worked. He'd been doing that math his entire life, calculating risk and exposure with the precision of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. So he stayed in his doorway, present, but separate, close enough to hear if she needed him, far enough to protect them both from the stories that could destroy his life with a single misunderstanding. This was not fear. He was not afraid of Victoria Ashford, not afraid of the situation, not afraid of what anyone might think. This was something else. Awareness. The particular vigilance that had been trained into him through 1,000 small lessons, a lifetime of navigating spaces where the rules for him were different than the rules for everyone else. Zoe shifted in her sleep down the hall, a small sound, almost nothing. But it grounded him, reminded him why every choice mattered, why caution wasn't cowardice but survival. She was his reason. Not his only reason, but his clearest one. Everything he did, every choice he made, filtered through the question of what world he was building for her, what example he was setting, what price she might have to pay for his decisions. If he went to Victoria now, if he sat beside her and offered comfort, he would not be doing anything wrong. He knew this with absolute certainty, but he also knew that doing nothing wrong was not the same as being protected. Innocence was not a shield, not for people who looked like him. History had taught that lesson too many times to ignore. So he stayed where he was, and eventually Victoria's crying quieted her. Breathing steadied into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. Darius returned to his bed. He didn't sleep. He lay there in the darkness, thinking about boundaries, about the weight of constantly calculating risk, about what it meant to be a good man in a world that would not always see him that way. Around 4 a.m, the rain finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost startling, the absence of sound, somehow louder than the storm had been. He thought about Sarah, how she used to tease him about his overthinking. "You're not responsible for everyone's assumptions," she would say. "Just be yourself." But being himself had never felt uncomplicated. Being himself required navigation, translation, the constant work of existing in spaces that tolerated his presence without ever fully accepting it. Being himself meant understanding that the same actions carried different weights depending on who performed them, that his margin for error was always smaller, his burden of proof always higher. The ceiling above him was cracked in one corner. He had been meaning to fix it for months, but there was always something more urgent, always some other demand. The crack remained a small imperfection in an imperfect life, a reminder that not everything could be controlled or corrected. In the living room, Victoria Ashford slept under borrowed blankets. Her powerful life temporarily suspended her vulnerability, witnessed by a man who understood that witnessing was sometimes the only safe thing to offer. And in the quiet space between them, in the darkness that held them both, something delicate survived the night. Morning arrived, grey and soft light filtering through the apartment windows, like something tentative, uncertain of its welcome. Darius woke to the smell of coffee and something else, something cooking that carried a faint edge of char. He found Victoria in his kitchen, barefoot, still her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, less armoured. She had found eggs, bread, butter. Simple ingredients transformed into an attempt at breakfast that was going slightly wrong. Zoe sat at the small kitchen table, chattering about her dreams with the enthusiasm of someone who believed everyone wanted to hear about the purple elephant she'd been riding. Victoria listened with apparent fascination, nodding at appropriate moments, asking questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. The scene was so domestic, so ordinary, that Darius had to blink several times to convince himself it was real. His CEO standing in his kitchen at 6:30 in the morning attempting to scramble eggs while his daughter narrated a fantastical journey through a candy-colored landscape. "She's teaching me about breakfast." Zoe's announcement carried the gravity of someone receiving instruction from a master. "Did you know eggs are better when you whisper to them?" Victoria caught Darius's eye over his daughter's head, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement of the strangeness of this situation, the impossible intimacy of sharing morning routines with someone who should have been a stranger, who by all reasonable measures was a stranger despite everything that had happened in the last 8 hours. "I don't actually whisper to eggs, but she asked if I had any cooking secrets, so I improvised." Darius poured himself coffee, moving around Victoria carefully in the small kitchen. Their arms didn't touch. Their bodies maintained the distance that had held through the night, an invisible boundary that protected them both from complications neither could afford. Through the window he noticed Mrs. Patterson from across the hall. She was taking out her garbage, but her route seemed unnecessarily circuitous, her pace unusually slow. Her gaze lingered on his window longer than casual glancing would explain, her eyes tracking movement inside with the focused attention of someone gathering information for future conversations. He knew that look. The preliminary data collection that would fuel speculation in laundry rooms and stairwells, that would build narratives from fragments and assumptions that would turn the simple act of making breakfast into something else entirely. Zoe remained oblivious, describing her dream about the purple elephant with increasing enthusiasm. But Victoria noticed. He saw her register Mrs. Patterson's attention, saw her understand what it meant, saw something tighten around her eyes. "If anyone asks," her voice was quiet, pitched below Zoe's chatter, "I'll tell them the truth. That I came here because I needed help. That you helped me." Darius nodded slowly. They both knew it wouldn't matter what she said. The story would become whatever people needed it to be, would conform to whatever narrative already existed in their minds about black men and white women, about power and impropriety, about boundaries that weren't supposed to be crossed. Breakfast was good. Zoe declared it the best eggs she'd ever had, which was high praise from a child who approached every meal as a potential disappointment. Victoria ate like someone who had forgotten what food tasted like, each bite seeming to remind her of something she'd lost, some simple pleasure that had been buried under years of working dinners and catered meetings. Afterward, Darius walked Victoria to the building's entrance. The morning was cool, washed clean by the night's rain. Puddles reflected grey sky, and somewhere a bird was singing its voice, carrying over the sound of early traffic. Her car was parked crookedly at the curb, evidence of her state when she'd arrived, the panic that had driven her here without thought for parking regulations or appearances. She paused at the door, her hand on the frame, hesitating like someone trying to find words for something that had no adequate language. "I don't know what happens next. With my brother, with the company, with any of it." Darius didn't offer reassurance. He didn't have any to give, didn't believe in empty comfort or false promises. "You'll figure it out. You did before." She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face like she was trying to memorize it, to capture something that might disappear if she didn't hold it carefully enough in her mind. "Thank you. For not asking questions. For not expecting anything." He nodded, and she turned and walked to her car, moving with something closer to her usual confidence, the vulnerability of the night settling back beneath the surface where it lived most of the time. He watched until she pulled away, until her taillights disappeared around the corner. Behind him, Mrs. Patterson had found another reason to linger in the hallway. Her eyes tracked him as he returned to his apartment full of curiosity. She wouldn't voice directly questions that would multiply in the asking, speculation that would spread like water finding cracks in concrete. Darius closed the door behind him and tried not to think about what the next few days might bring.
The summons came 3 days later. Darius was called to the 19th floor, 2 levels above his usual territory. A conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the harbour that cost more than his annual salary, that reminded everyone who entered it about the value of height, the rewards of climbing. 3 people waited for him. Bennett Henderson, his supervisor. A woman from HR whose nameplate read Jessica Morgan, whose expression carried the careful neutrality of someone trained to deliver bad news without visible emotion. And a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Richard Ashford, Victoria's brother, the one trying to take her company. "Please, sit down." Richard's gesture toward the empty chair was smooth, practiced the movement of someone accustomed to directing others.
The chair was positioned so that Darius faced all 3 of them, the windows behind their backs turning them into silhouettes, their features obscured by backlighting. A deliberate arrangement. He recognized the tactic from 100 negotiations he'd witnessed from the margins, the careful staging designed to create psychological disadvantage. "We appreciate you taking the time." Richard's voice matched his suit, expensive and well-tailored, designed to project authority without obvious aggression. "We have an opportunity we'd like to discuss with you." The opportunity was presented in careful stages, each element introduced with the precision of someone building an argument toward an inevitable conclusion. A promotion. A significant salary increase, the numbers spoken aloud to ensure he understood their magnitude. A corner office on a higher floor, windows that would let in more light space, that would announce his importance to everyone who saw it. All the things Darius had been passed over for during 6 years of exemplary performance, suddenly available, suddenly within reach. The catch came buried in the middle, delivered almost as an afterthought, as if it were a minor detail rather than the entire purpose of this meeting. "We are conducting a review of certain executive decisions. Historical matters, due diligence patterns, leadership effectiveness over time." Richard's smile never wavered. "You understand? We'd value your perspective on some of the patterns you've observed. Your unique position gives you insights that others might miss." Jessica slid a folder across the table, the movement controlled and deliberate. Inside were photographs that made Darius's stomach turn cold. Victoria's car outside his building, the license plate clearly visible. Victoria entering his apartment, the timestamp glowing in the corner, 12:47 a.m. The angle suggested someone had been watching, waiting, documenting. "We're not making accusations." Jessica's tone suggested otherwise carried implications that hung in the air like smoke. "We simply want to understand the nature of your relationship with the CEO. Context matters in our review process." Darius sat very still, his mind running calculations faster than any spreadsheet he'd ever built. He thought about Zoe, about the tuition for the better school he'd been saving for the future he wanted to give her. He thought about medical bills from Sarah's illness that still surfaced occasionally, unexpected invoices from a grief he thought he'd finished paying. He thought about Victoria crying on his couch, saying his name like it meant something, like he was more than just another analyst who could be replaced. Then he pushed the folder back across the table, the motion final and unambiguous. "No." Richard's smile flickered like a candle in wind. "Excuse me, no. I won't be participating in whatever this is." He stood up his chair, scraping against the floor, the sound harsh in the careful quiet of the conference room. "Think carefully about this, Darius." Henderson leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of someone offering wisdom to the foolish. "Opportunities like this don't come along often, for someone in your position." The emphasis was subtle but unmistakable. Your position. Your place. The unspoken architecture of who belonged where, who deserved what, who should be grateful for whatever scraps fell from tables they would never sit at. Darius looked at each of them in turn. Henderson, whose face carried the same careful distance it always had. Jessica, who couldn't meet his eyes, who was complicit in whatever machinery of destruction this was, but lacked the courage to own it. Richard Ashford, whose smile had curdled into something uglier, stripped of pretense now that the offer had been refused. "I have. And the answer is still no." He walked out of the conference room, past the assistants who pretended not to watch, toward the elevator that would carry him back to his own floor. His heart was pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his throat, but his hands were steady. Behind him, he heard Richard's voice, cold now, stripped of its earlier pretense at civility. "He'll regret this." Darius pressed the elevator button and waited. He probably would regret it. The calculation was simple enough, but not for the reasons they imagined, not because he'd turned down money or status or the illusion of advancement. He'd regret it because he understood what came next, understood that refusal carried consequences designed to break people who didn't comply. The retaliation began 4 days after the summons. Swift and methodical, executed with the efficiency of people who had done this before. Darius found himself placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into unspecified irregularities in his work. His access badge was deactivated without ceremony. His company email was suspended, cutting him off from colleagues and projects midstream. He received these notifications by certified mail, each one stamped with the corporate logo he had served faithfully for 6 years, now weaponized against him. But the professional consequences were almost manageable compared to what happened next. Someone leaked his personnel file to a blog that specialized in corporate gossip, the kind of site that thrived on scandal and innuendo that built traffic from the wreckage of other people's reputations. His home address was suddenly public information available to anyone with internet access and bad intentions. His photograph appeared alongside speculation about his relationship with Victoria Ashford, the narrative carefully constructed to suggest impropriety without stating it outright to plant questions that would grow in fertile ground. The article used language that seemed neutral on the surface but carried unmistakable implications. Questions were raised rather than accusations made. Concerns were noted rather than conclusions drawn. The entire piece was designed to destroy by suggestion, to create doubt without providing evidence, to let readers fill in blanks with their worst assumptions. Comments accumulated beneath the article like sediment, layer upon layer of judgment and assumption. He made the mistake of reading them once, scrolling through the venom and certainty the way strangers felt entitled to opinions about his life, his choices, his character. The racism was sometimes explicit, but more often coded, wrapped in concern about professionalism and appropriate boundaries, about the dangers of mixing business with personal relationships. He never read them again, but the damage was done. The poison absorbed into his understanding of how quickly a life could be dismantled by people who didn't know him, who had never met him, who felt nonetheless qualified to destroy him. Zoe came home from school one afternoon with questions that no 7-year-old should have to ask. A classmate's parent had seen something online, had said something within earshot of children, and the cruelty had filtered down through layers of adult carelessness until it reached his daughter's ears, distilled into simple words that carried complicated damage. "Daddy, why did that lady say you did something bad?" Her voice was small and confused, trying to reconcile the father she knew with the villain being constructed in digital spaces she didn't understand. He held her for a long time, searching for words that would protect her from a world he couldn't control, from narratives he couldn't fight, from the ways that power crushed people who refused to bow. He wanted to explain that sometimes people made up stories about others, that lies could spread faster than truth, that adults weren't always fair or kind or honest. But she was 7, and the world was still supposed to make sense at 7, and he couldn't bring himself to steal that from her entirely. Sometimes people misunderstand things. They see something and think it means something else. It's not your fault and it's not my fault. It's just what happens sometimes. She seemed satisfied with this answer, or at least willing to accept it, her resilience, a gift he didn't deserve, but accepted with gratitude. She went to her room to play, and he sat alone in the kitchen, trying to remember how to breathe normally, how to function when everything felt like it was collapsing. Meanwhile, Victoria Ashford faced her own siege. The photographs from outside Darius's apartment building became ammunition in her brother's campaign, evidence marshaled to question her judgment, her fitness, her capacity to lead. Board members who had been loyal for decades suddenly found reasons to doubt, to wonder, to consider alternatives they would never have entertained before. The narrative Richard constructed was elegant in its viciousness, suggesting not wrongdoing, but weakness, not corruption, but poor decision-making, a loss of the sharp instincts that had made her successful. He never accused Victoria of anything specific, never made claims that could be directly refuted. Instead, he raised questions, expressed concerns, noted patterns that might warrant further examination. The business press covered the story with barely concealed delight. Another powerful woman brought low, another reminder that authority was always conditional for those who didn't fit the traditional mold. Headlines spoke of leadership transitions and strategic reviews, language that sounded professional, but carried unmistakable implications about Victoria's future at the company she had built. The details didn't matter. The shape of the story was irresistible, conforming to expectations so deeply embedded that they felt like truth rather than prejudice. A CEO making poor decisions, a woman letting emotion cloud judgment. The narrative practically wrote itself, required minimal effort from those eager to believe it. Darius watched from the outside, unable to help, unable to even contact her without making things worse. The mathematics of their situation were brutal in their simplicity. Any communication between them would be interpreted as evidence of whatever story people wanted to believe would confirm suspicions rather than dispel them. Distance was the only protection they had, and even that was inadequate against determined enemies with resources and reach. Some nights, after Zoe was asleep, He sat in his kitchen and wondered if he had made the right choice, if saying no in that conference room had been courage or foolishness, if protecting his integrity was worth the cost his daughter was now paying. The questions circled through his mind without resolution, without comfort, offering only the cold clarity of consequences fully manifested. He didn't have answers. He only had the memory of Victoria's eyes when she'd asked about his analysis 3 years ago, the way she had looked at him like his truth mattered, like he was worth listening to. And he had the memory of that night of her vulnerability and his daughter's kindness, of the simple fact that sometimes doing the right thing didn't require certainty about outcomes, only clarity about principles. That had to be worth something. He had to believe it was worth something because the alternative was accepting that honesty was a luxury he couldn't afford, that survival required compromise with people who saw him as a tool to be used or an obstacle to be removed. The pressure continued to build, mechanical and relentless. Bills accumulated on his kitchen table, red notices replacing white deadlines approaching with the inevitability of weather. The savings he'd carefully built over years of disciplined spending began to drain away, consumed by ordinary expenses that suddenly felt extraordinary without steady income. Interviews at other firms went nowhere once they ran background checks, once his name triggered whatever flags had been planted in databases he couldn't see. HR representatives who had been warm on initial calls became distant after lunch, their enthusiasm cooling once they'd consulted with legal or compliance or whoever made decisions about acceptable risk. Nobody said it directly. Nobody had to. The machinery of professional exclusion operated smoothly, quietly, leaving no fingerprints while ensuring outcomes. He was being blacklisted without anyone explicitly blacklisting him, shut out of opportunities through mechanisms so subtle they were nearly impossible to challenge or prove. His landlord mentioned casually that someone had been asking questions about his lease, about his reliability, about whether there had been any complaints. The conversation was friendly on the surface, but the message was clear. People were watching. People were asking. People were building cases for actions not yet taken but clearly contemplated. Darius understood what was happening. He was being squeezed from every direction, pressure applied to every vulnerable point until something broke. The offer was still there, implicit in every new hardship. Cooperate. Give Richard Ashford what he wanted. Provide the perspective that would help destroy Victoria's reputation. And in exchange, all of this would stop. The investigation would conclude favorably. The job offers would materialize. The bills would become manageable again. The pattern was obvious to anyone paying attention, but proving it was another matter entirely. Richard was careful, his fingerprints absent from the visible mechanisms of pressure, the entire operation designed to look like natural consequences rather than orchestrated punishment. Darius thought about Zoe's face when she'd asked about the lady, and the bad thing about the confusion in her voice, about the way she was learning lessons about the world that he'd hoped to delay for years. He thought about his father, who had worked 30 years in a factory that never promoted him, who had told Darius once that a man's dignity was the only thing that couldn't be taken away without his permission. He thought about Victoria alone in her own battle, fighting against her own brother, betrayed by family in ways that cut deeper than any corporate maneuvering ever could. And he thought about the night she had knocked on his door because she remembered someone who told the truth, because in a world of careful lies and strategic evasions, honesty had meant something worth remembering. The pressure built. Darius held. Week after week, as his resources dwindled and opportunities vanished, as the weight accumulated and the future grew darker. He held because the alternative was surrender, was validation of a system designed to break people like him, was teaching his daughter that principles only mattered when they were convenient. The meeting happened in a park overlooking the harbour, the same harbour visible from the 19th floor conference room where Richard had made his offer. But here, the view was different, accessible to anyone willing to walk down to the waterfront, democratic, in a way that corner offices could never be. Victoria had sent word through a channel Darius didn't fully understand. A handwritten note slipped under his door by a messenger who disappeared before he could ask questions. No phones, no emails, no paper trail. Just a time and a place coordinates for a conversation that needed to happen outside the surveillance of technology. She was sitting on a bench when he arrived, her posture different than it had been in his apartment. Harder. The vulnerability of that night had been replaced by something closer to battle readiness, the transformation visible in the set of her shoulders, the way she held her spine. She looked tired in a way that went beyond sleep deprivation, exhausted by the constant vigilance required to fight enemies on multiple fronts. He sat down beside her, leaving space between them, maintaining the boundary that protected them both from interpretations they couldn't control. "I'm sorry." The words came before he could speak, raw and immediate. "For what they've done to you. What they're doing." He nodded. He had already forgiven her if there was anything to forgive. She hadn't chosen this any more than he had. They were both caught in machinery. Neither had designed ground between forces that cared nothing for intention or innocence. My brother made me an offer yesterday. Victoria's voice carried exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue, a weariness that came from fighting battles on too many fronts for too long. Step down quietly. Take a settlement. Walk away from everything I built. What did you say? She turned to face him, and he could see the cost written on her face, the price of resistance visible in shadows beneath her eyes in lines that hadn't been there a week ago. I told him I would think about it. The pause that followed felt deliberate, loaded with meaning. But I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to fight. Darius let this settle, understanding what it meant. Fighting meant prolonging the conflict, extending the scrutiny on both of them, accepting more damage in hopes of eventual vindication. Fighting meant choosing the hard road when the easy path was clearly marked and well lit. Why are you telling me this? Because I need to know if I'm being selfish. The honesty in her voice was startling, stripped of the careful language she usually employed. If my fighting makes things worse for you, if you'd rather I walked away, so this could all just stop. He considered the question carefully, weighing what he wanted against what would make his life easier, what would protect Zoe from more questions she shouldn't have to answer. He thought about the conference room, about Richard's smile, about the folder full of photographs taken by someone who had been watching, waiting for a moment that could be twisted into something it wasn't. He thought about what it would mean if people like that won, because people like him stepped aside, chose safety over principle, accepted that the only way to survive was to surrender. Fight. Victoria studied his face, searching for certainty in his expression. Are you sure? The question hung between them, weighted with history. 3 years ago, she had asked him the same thing in a different conference room, testing whether he really believed what he was saying. And he had looked at her then and told her the truth had refused to soften or equivocate. Say it again. Say it while you look at me. His words carried hers back to her, an echo across time, a reminder of the moment when she had first learned to trust him. Victoria almost smiled, something breaking through the exhaustion on her face. Are you sure I'm sure? He met her eyes as he said it, holding her gaze the way he had before offering certainty when everything else was uncertain. They sat together in silence for a while, watching the water, watching light play across the surface of the harbour. Two people who had found themselves on the same side of a war, neither of them had chosen allies by accident and necessity. Victoria reached over and placed something on the bench between them, a small folder thinner than the one Richard had shown him. My lawyers found this. Evidence of what my brother has been doing. Financial irregularities, falsified reports. Enough to stop him if it gets to the right people. Darius looked at the folder, but didn't touch it, understanding the weight of what she was offering, the trust implicit in showing him information that could be weaponized, that could make him a target if anyone knew he possessed it. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I just wanted you to know the truth exists, even when it's buried, even when powerful people try to hide it. He understood what she was offering him. Not involvement, not risk, but knowledge. The dignity of being trusted with the truth, of being seen as someone worth confiding in rather than someone to be protected or managed. Thank you. Victoria stood, her movements carrying finality. I should go. I don't know how this ends, Darius. But whatever happens, I wanted you to know that I'm fighting because of you. Because you reminded me what it looks like to stand up when it costs something. She walked away, leaving him alone on the bench. Darius sat for a long time after she left, watching the light change on the water, thinking about dignity and courage and the complicated mathematics of choosing right over easy. When he finally stood to leave, the folder was still on the bench where she'd placed it. He picked it up and took it with him. That night, after Zoe was asleep, Darius opened the folder and studied its contents. Financial documents, email trails, evidence of systematic fraud that had been hidden beneath layers of legitimate transactions. Richard Ashford had been siphoning money from the company for years, falsifying reports to cover the gaps, buying board votes with funds he'd stolen from the very entity he was trying to control. The evidence was comprehensive, damning assembled by lawyers who understood both the law and the art of building an unassailable case. But it was also incomplete. It showed what Richard had done, but not all of how he'd done it, left gaps that a skilled defense attorney could exploit, created room for alternative explanations that might muddy waters enough to prevent decisive action. Darius spent hours cross-referencing the documents with public filings he pulled from SEC databases, using the analytical skills he'd honed over years of making sense of numbers that didn't want to make sense. He found discrepancies patterns that emerged only when you knew what to look for, evidence that would strengthen Victoria's case if it reached the right people. He built a comprehensive analysis, laying out the fraud in language that board members could understand, that investigators could act on, that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The work consumed him, pulled him deep into spreadsheets and financial statements, into the kind of detailed analysis that had always been his strength.
And then he prepared to do something that could either save Victoria or destroy them both. He created an anonymous email account, routing it through encryption services he'd learned about during his weeks of unemployment, during hours spent on forums where people discussed digital privacy and secure communication. The technical details were complex, but the principle was simple. Create enough layers between sender and message that tracing became impossible, or at least impractical enough to discourage casual investigation. He drafted a message attaching the analysis he'd built, the evidence Victoria's lawyers had gathered, the additional documentation he'd uncovered through his own research. The subject line was simple, direct, impossible to ignore. The truth about Richard Ashford, from someone who knows numbers. He addressed it to each of the 12 board members, to the SEC, to the FBI's white-collar crime division.
And then he sat there, his finger hovering over the send button, understanding that this moment was a threshold he couldn't uncross. If he sent this, he was choosing sides in a war that wasn't officially his. He was risking everything on the hope that truth mattered, that evidence could overcome power, that the system worked, even when it seemed designed to protect people like Richard Ashford. He was betting his future and Zoe's future on the idea that doing the right thing would ultimately be rewarded, or at least not punished forever. He thought about Zoe, about the world he wanted her to inherit, about what it would mean if she grew up believing that the only way to survive was to look away when powerful people did wrong things. He thought about his father in that factory, never promoted but never compromised, maintaining dignity through decades of being overlooked. He hit send at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, the timestamp marking the moment when he stopped being a witness and became a participant. The battle for Ashford Capital played out over months, a corporate war fought in boardrooms and courtrooms and the pages of business publications that treated other people's destruction as entertainment. The evidence Darius had sent proved decisive at a critical board meeting in late October, exposing Richard's financial manipulations with a clarity that couldn't be denied or spun. Board loyalties shifted back to Victoria, not out of loyalty, but out of self-preservation, once they understood that supporting Richard meant being associated with fraud, meant potential legal exposure, meant being on the wrong side of a story that was rapidly taking shape in ways that would be remembered. The victory wasn't clean. Corporate wars never were. Reputations were damaged on all sides. Trust was broken in ways that couldn't be easily repaired. Relationships that had seemed solid revealed themselves as transactional and conditional. But it was decisive. Richard Ashford resigned from the company on a Friday in late October and left the country within 72 hours, his reputation destroyed by revelations he had never expected to surface. Darius watched these developments from a distance, his name never appearing in the coverage, his role remaining invisible, which was how he wanted it. Recognition would have brought attention he couldn't afford, would have made him a target for Richard's remaining allies, would have complicated his life in ways that offered no benefit worth the cost. 3 weeks after Richard's resignation, the investigation into Darius's work was quietly dropped. No announcement, no explanation, just a notation in his personnel file that the matter had been resolved with no findings of misconduct. His access badge was reactivated. His company email flickered back to life as if it had never been suspended. The machinery of his professional existence resumed its normal operations, indifferent to the weeks it had spent grinding him down. A letter arrived by courier, delivered to his apartment on a Wednesday afternoon when Zoe was at school. The envelope was thick, expensive paper embossed with the Ashford Capital logo. Inside, formal language apologized for any inconvenience during the review process, offered his position back with retroactive pay, covering the weeks he'd been suspended, included a modest increase in salary, as if money could compensate for what had been taken. He read the letter in his kitchen. The same kitchen where Victoria had attempted to make breakfast, where Zoe had prepared hot chocolate for a stranger, where he had sat night after night wondering if choosing integrity over survival was a luxury he couldn't afford. The apology was professionally crafted, legally vetted, carefully worded to avoid admission of wrongdoing, while extending an olive branch that looked generous on paper. But Darius knew what it really was. A transaction. A closing of accounts. An attempt to restore equilibrium, as if the past month had been an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a deliberate campaign of destruction. He set the letter down and stared at it for a long time, thinking about what it would mean to go back to walk into that building and pretend nothing had happened, to sit at his old desk and resume the careful performance he'd been executing for 6 years. "Daddy, are you going back to work?" Zoe had come home from school while he was lost in thought, her backpack sliding off her shoulders as she climbed into the chair next to him. Her question was simple, direct, the kind of inquiry that cut through complexity to reach the essential choice. I don't know yet. I have to think about what kind of place it is. She tilted her head, considering this with the seriousness she brought to important matters. Is it a place where people are nice? Sometimes. It's a place where some people are nice, and some people are learning. Zoe seemed satisfied with this answer, turning her attention to the snack he'd prepared, her mind already moving to other concerns. But Darius remained at the table, the letter in front of him, the weight of decision pressing down. 2 days later, his phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, the first direct contact they'd had since the park, since she'd walked away, leaving him with a folder full of evidence that he'd transformed into something more powerful than she could have anticipated. I'd like to offer you a position. Her voice carried the formality of a business call, professional boundaries re-established now that the immediate crisis had passed. Senior analyst reporting directly to me. Real authority, real responsibility, real path to advancement. The offer was specific, concrete, the kind of thing he'd been waiting for throughout his entire tenure at Ashford Capital. Everything he'd earned but never received, suddenly available, suddenly within reach. Why? The question came out more blunt than he'd intended, but he needed to understand the motivation, needed to know if this was gratitude or guilt or something else entirely. Because you earned it. Years ago. Victoria's response was immediate, carrying certainty that suggested she'd been thinking about this longer than the past few weeks. And because this company needs people who tell the truth, people who do the right thing when it costs something. We've had enough of the other kind. Can I have time to think? Of course. A pause, and then her voice softened slightly, the professional veneer thinning just enough to let something more personal through. But Darius, I hope you'll say yes. Not for my sake. For yours. For Zoe's. He hung up and sat with the weight of 2 offers, 2 versions of his future laid out like paths diverging from a single point. Return to what had been, or step forward into something new. Safety or possibility. The familiar cage or the unfamiliar sky. The decision took 3 days. He spent the time talking to Zoe in the careful way he'd learned, asking questions that let her reveal her thoughts without imposing his own anxieties. He walked through his neighborhood, past the corner where Sarah used to buy flowers on Sundays, past the school where Zoe was learning to navigate a world that wouldn't always be kind to her, past the laundromat where Mrs. Patterson and her friends gathered to exchange information and judgment in equal measure. He thought about his father's words about dignity that couldn't be taken without permission. But he also thought about what came after dignity, about building something that lasted longer than a single act of resistance, about creating change rather than just surviving systems designed to grind people down. On Monday morning, he called Victoria and accepted the position. The first few weeks in his new role were a study in adjustment and recalibration. The office on the 21st floor wasn't ready yet, still being prepared with the technology and furniture befitting a senior analyst who reported directly to the CEO. So Darius worked from a temporary space, smaller than what had been promised, but already better than what he'd left behind. The work was immediately different. Victoria included him in meetings that would have been far above his previous clearance level, sought his analysis on decisions that would shape the company's direction for years. She didn't treat him as a token or a symbol, didn't parade him around as evidence of her commitment to change. Instead, she put him to work, gave him real problems that required the full scope of his capabilities, trusted him to deliver insights that would inform choices involving millions of dollars. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. For the first time in his career at Ashford Capital, he felt like he was being used properly, like his skills were being deployed at their appropriate level, rather than being wasted on tasks designed to keep him busy, but not influential. The other executives took their cues from Victoria, treating Darius with a respect that seemed genuine rather than performative. Some of them were the same people who had overlooked him for years, who had repeated his ideas as their own, who had nodded politely while dismissing everything he said. But power had a way of changing perceptions, and his proximity to Victoria granted him an authority that his credentials alone had never provided. He noticed the shift in small ways. When he spoke in meetings, people took notes. When he sent emails, they received prompt responses. When he walked through the halls, colleagues greeted him by name, correctly pronounced, without the slight pause that used to precede interactions. Henderson had been reassigned to a different division. His authority diminished in ways that suggested consequences without public humiliation. Darius saw him occasionally in the elevator or the cafeteria, their exchanges brief and professional, carrying none of the underlying tension that had characterized their previous relationship. Henderson seemed smaller, somehow diminished not just in rank, but in presence, as if the removal of unearned power had revealed how little substance remained beneath. Jessica from HR was still there, still maintaining her careful neutrality, still executing whatever directives came from above, without apparent moral consideration.
Darius didn't seek her out, didn't confront her about her role in Richard's campaign. There seemed little point. She had been a tool, willing but not driving, and tools were rarely worth the energy of anger. The changes at Ashford Capital extended beyond his personal situation. Victoria had used the crisis as an opportunity for comprehensive restructuring, bringing in new board members who challenged, rather than confirmed, hiring executives who understood that diversity wasn't just optics, but operational advantage. The culture was shifting slowly but measurably towards something that might eventually resemble actual meritocracy, rather than the carefully maintained hierarchy that had preceded it. 6 weeks into his new position, Darius received an invitation to a company event, a formal dinner celebrating Ashford Capital's return to financial stability after the turbulence of Richard's attempted coup and subsequent exposure. The invitation was marked with a handwritten note in Victoria's distinctive script. "I'd appreciate your presence, not as my analyst, but as someone who helped save this company when it mattered most." He almost declined. The prospect of formal clothes and careful conversations of being on display in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable was almost enough to outweigh the implied importance of the request. But then he thought about what it would mean to Zoe if he explained why he'd chosen to hide rather than attend, what lessons she would internalize about belonging and worth and the right to occupy spaces that hadn't traditionally welcomed people who looked like him. He found a suit that still fit, pressed it carefully arranged for his neighbor to watch Zoe for the evening. Mrs. Patterson had offered, surprisingly, her manner warmer than it had been before, as if some calculation had shifted in her assessment of him. He had declined politely, but appreciated the gesture, the small sign that narratives could change even in the stubborn soil of neighborhood gossip. The dinner was held at a hotel downtown ballroom with chandeliers and white tablecloths, and waiters moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Darius arrived exactly on time, neither early enough to seem anxious, nor late enough to draw attention. The room was already filling with executives and board members, with investors and partners, with all the people who comprised the constellation of power around Ashford Capital. He saw Henderson across the room, speaking with a cluster of people from the division he'd been reassigned to. Their eyes met briefly, and Henderson nodded with something that might have been respect or simply acknowledgement. No warmth, but also no hostility. Just recognition of existence, which was perhaps all that was needed. Jessica from HR was there too, her expression carefully neutral when she saw him maintaining the professional distance that suggested she preferred to forget her role in Richard's campaign. Darius didn't judge her too harshly. She had been a tool, willing, but not driving, complicit, but not primary. The machinery of institutions required many hands, most of them just following instructions, without fully understanding the damage they enabled. Victoria appeared near the front of the room, speaking with board members, her presence commanding without being aggressive. She wore a dark blue dress that suggested power without ostentation, her hair styled in a way that looked both professional and approachable. When she saw Darius, she excused herself and crossed the room to where he stood. "Thank you for coming." Her greeting was warm, but not excessive, calibrated to avoid drawing unwanted attention to the nature of their relationship, whatever that relationship actually was. "I know these things aren't easy." He appreciated the acknowledgement, the recognition that his presence here required more effort than it did for most of the people in this room. "They aren't, but they're important." She smiled, and in that smile he saw traces of the woman who had stood in his doorway barefoot and terrified, who had cried quietly in his living room, who had drunk hot chocolate made by a 7-year-old and accepted kindness from strangers when her own family had betrayed her. "Walk with me." It wasn't really a question, more an invitation that carried the weight of intention. They moved through the room together, Victoria introducing him to people he'd only seen in photographs or from a distance. Board members who had questioned her judgment, investors who had wavered during the crisis, partners who had watched from the sidelines waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Each introduction was deliberate. Victoria's language making clear that Darius was not just another employee, but someone whose contributions had been essential, whose presence at this celebration was earned rather than granted. She was using her platform to elevate him, to shift perceptions, to create space in rooms like this for people who had traditionally been excluded or marginalized. Some of the introductions were awkward, people not quite sure how to respond to this disruption of expected hierarchies. Others were genuinely warm executives who seemed to understand what Victoria was doing and approved, who extended hands and made conversation that felt authentic
rather than performative. Darius navigated it all with the skill he'd developed over years of operating in spaces that required constant translation code switching between different audiences, managing perceptions while trying to maintain some core of authenticity. It was exhausting work, but work he knew how to do, work that mattered in ways that extended beyond his own career advancement. During dinner, he found himself seated at Victoria's table, a positioning that announced his status more clearly than any title could. The conversation ranged across topics, business and politics and culture, the kind of wide-ranging discussion that people at this level engaged in to demonstrate their breadth of knowledge and sophistication. He contributed when he had something to say, remained quiet when he didn't, refusing to perform expertise he didn't possess just to maintain visibility. And he noticed that people listened when he spoke, that his words were received with the same attention given to everyone else at the table, that he was being treated as an equal rather than a curiosity or a token. Halfway through the meal, Victoria stood to deliver brief remarks, thanking everyone for their support during the recent challenges, acknowledging the hard work required to restore stability, looking forward to continued success. Her speech was polished, professional, hitting all the expected notes. But near the end, she departed from whatever script she'd prepared, her voice taking on a more personal quality. This company survived its recent crisis, not because of any single person, but because people were willing to tell hard truths when it would have been easier to stay silent. Because integrity turned out to matter more than convenience. Because there are still people who understand that doing the right thing isn't always the same as doing the easy thing. She paused, and her eyes found Darius across the table. I'm grateful to everyone who stood up when it counted, who chose principle over expedience, who reminded me what leadership actually means. The applause that followed was genuine,
And Darius felt dozens of eyes shift toward him, subtle but unmistakable. People making connections, understanding something about the subtext of Victoria's words, recognizing that he was more than just another analyst at the senior level. After dinner, as people dispersed into smaller conversations, Darius found himself on a balcony overlooking the city. The night air was cool, carrying sounds from the street below, a welcome respite from the controlled climate of the ballroom. He stood there, breathing in the urban mixture of exhaust and possibility, letting the tension of performance drain away. You did well in there. Victoria had joined him, standing a respectful distance away, maintaining the boundaries they both understood were necessary. I know it wasn't comfortable. It was important. He turned to look at her, seeing her more clearly now than he had that first night when rain and fear had obscured so much. She had changed, he realized. Or maybe she'd just become more of whatever had always been there beneath the armor, the person who valued truth enough to seek it from a junior analyst who had no reason to give it, except that lying would have been worse. Can I ask you something? Her question was tentative, carrying uncertainty that seemed unusual for someone who commanded rooms full of powerful people. Of course. Do you think people can really change? Not just adjust their behavior, but actually become different than they were? Darius considered this carefully, understanding that the question was personal, that she was asking about herself as much as anyone. I think people can grow, can learn from mistakes, from pain, from moments when everything falls apart. Whether that's the same as changing, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't matter what we call it. He looked out at the city, at lights spreading toward horizons he couldn't see.
I think what matters is whether we're better today than we were yesterday, whether we're building something that lasts, whether we're creating space for other people to grow too. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Then she spoke, her voice carrying a weight that suggested she'd been holding these words for a while, waiting for the right moment to release them. That night when I came to your apartment, I was running from my brother, from the betrayal, from everything falling apart. But I was also running towards something, even if I didn't know it at the time. She turned to face him directly, her expression open in a way he'd rarely seen. I was running toward the possibility that someone would see me as something other than a CEO or a target or a piece in someone else's game, just as a person who needed help. And you gave me that. You and Zoe. You treated me like a human being when I'd forgotten how to be one. Darius didn't know what to say to this, didn't trust his ability to respond to such naked honesty without diminishing it somehow. So he simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words without trying to minimize or reframe them. I'm not sure I've properly thanked you. Victoria's voice was softer now, almost tentative, not just for the evidence, for the analysis that helped stop Richard, but for the kindness, for the hot chocolate and the towel and the space to fall apart without being judged for it. You don't need to thank me for that. I think I do. I think it's important to acknowledge when someone gives you something you didn't know you needed. They stood together in silence for a while, watching the city, listening to the muted sounds of the party continuing behind them. Two people who had started in different worlds and found themselves briefly sharing the same space, understanding that whatever connection they'd formed would always be complicated by the realities of power and race and professional hierarchy, but was real nonetheless. Eventually, they returned to the party to separate conversations and appropriate distances to the roles they played in public spaces. But something had been acknowledged between them, some debt recognized if not fully repaid, some understanding reached about what they had given each other and what they had built from the wreckage of that rainy night. Darius left the event earlier than most, declining offers of drinks and further networking, eager to get home to Zoe to return to the life that mattered more than any ballroom conversation ever could. As he walked to his car, he thought about Victoria's question about whether people could really change. He didn't have a definitive answer. But he knew that he had changed, that the past months had transformed him in ways both visible and hidden. He was more willing to take up space now, less apologetic about his presence in rooms that had traditionally excluded him, more confident in his voice, his analysis, his right to be heard. And he knew that Victoria had changed too, that the woman who had knocked on his door was different from the CEO who had ruled Ashford Capital with perfect control and careful distance. She had learned something about vulnerability, about trust, about the ways that breaking could be the prelude to building something stronger. Maybe that was enough. Maybe change didn't require complete transformation, just consistent movement in a better direction, just the willingness to learn from mistakes and adjust course when the old way stopped working. 8 months after accepting Victoria's offer, Darius sat in his permanent office on the 21st floor, morning light streaming through windows that offered a view of the harbour he'd only seen from parks before. The space was his earned through years of work that had finally been recognised, equipped with technology and resources that made his old desk seem like a relic from another era. The work remained challenging problems that required the full scope of his analytical skills rather than just the portions that made others comfortable. When he spoke in meetings now, people listened with the kind of attention that suggested they actually valued what he had to say. Not because they had to, not out of obligation or guilt, but because they had learned that his words carried weight, that his analysis revealed patterns others missed. Things at Ashford Capital continued changing, the transformation incremental but visible to anyone paying attention. More faces like his appeared in conference rooms, voices that had been silent before finding space to speak. The shift wasn't revolutionary, wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines or trigger profiles in business magazines, but it was real, measurable in small ways that accumulated over time into something that resembled actual progress. The old patterns hadn't disappeared entirely. Unconscious bias didn't evaporate just because leadership declared it unwelcome. But there was accountability now, mechanisms for addressing inequities, when they surfaced, a willingness to examine systems rather than just blaming individuals. The playing field wasn't level yet, might never be perfectly level, but it was less tilted than before. At home, life had found rhythms that incorporated work without being consumed by it. Zoe was thriving at a better school funded by the salary increase that had come with his promotion. She made friends easily, brought home stories about teachers and playground dynamics and books she was reading, asked questions about the world that he tried to answer with honesty, tempered by hope. Some nights they made hot chocolate together, using the little marshmallows that melted just right, maintaining the ritual that Zoe had invented and perfected. She would talk about her day while he listened with the attention she deserved, grateful for the simple fact of her presence, her resilience, her capacity to remain kind in a world that didn't always reward kindness. One evening they sat on the couch watching a movie she'd chosen, something animated with talking animals and lessons about friendship. Halfway through, she looked up at him with an expression that suggested she'd been thinking about something for a while, building up to a question. "Daddy, I remember when that sad lady came to our house." The memory was months old now, but clearly still present for her, filed away in whatever system children use to make sense of adult complications. "I remember too. She wasn't sad when she left. I think we helped her. I think so too." Zoe was quiet for a moment, her attention seemingly back on the movie, but Darius could sense there was more coming, could feel the weight of something she needed to say. "I'm glad you didn't bow your head." The words surprised him, their specificity, suggesting she'd been carrying them for a while, waiting for the right moment to deliver them. "That's what my teacher says strong people do. They don't bow their heads when it's hard." Darius pulled his daughter close, feeling the trust in the way she leaned against him, the absolute faith she had that he would protect her, guide her, show her how to be strong. Her teacher was right and wrong, he thought. Sometimes strong people did bow their heads strategically for survival, choosing battles carefully, because not every hill was worth dying on. The world was more complicated than children's books suggested, more nuanced than simple lessons about courage and integrity could capture. But on that night in that apartment with that woman standing at his door, he had chosen not to bow. and Zoe had seen it, had remembered. It had internalized something about strength that would shape how she moved through the world. That was worth something. Maybe everything. Across the city, in a corner office overlooking the harbour from an even higher floor, Victoria Ashford worked late into the evening. The view from here was expansive, showing the city spreading out toward distant horizons, lights beginning to appear as dusk settled over Baltimore. Her desk was clear except for essential items organized with the precision of someone who had learned that control over small things helped manage larger uncertainties. On one corner sat a photograph that hadn't been there before the troubles, before Richard's betrayal, before the night she'd driven through rain to knock on a door she had no right to knock on. The frame was simple, purchased from a drugstore, rather than a gallery cheap plastic that held something more valuable than its construction suggested. Inside was a picture of a mug with marshmallows floating on top, the image slightly blurred as if taken quickly without attention to focus or composition. She had photographed it that morning in Darius's kitchen, before any of them knew what was coming, before the machinery of destruction had been set in motion.
A reminder of the moment before the storm, captured in sugar and chocolate, and the simple kindness of a child who believed sadness could be addressed with hot beverages and attention. Victoria looked at it when the pressure built, when board meetings stretched into battles, when the loneliness of leadership threatened to overwhelm her capacity to carry it. The photograph reminded her that somewhere in this city was a man who had seen her at her worst and offered tea instead of judgment, who had maintained boundaries that protected them both while still offering sanctuary. And a child who had looked at her sadness and responded with chocolate and truth, who had shown her what kindness looked like when it wasn't contaminated by calculation or expectation. The battles continued, would always continue. Corporate wars and market pressures, and the endless negotiation of power and principle that defined life at this altitude.
But some things had shifted in ways that couldn't be easily measured or quantified. Victoria had learned to trust differently, to value honesty over comfort, to surround herself with people who would tell her hard truths rather than easy lies. The near destruction of everything she'd built had taught her that success without integrity was just a slower form of failure, that winning by compromising core principles meant losing the only things that actually mattered. She had also learned something about vulnerability, about the strength required to ask for help, about the ways that breaking down could be the prelude to building something better. That night in Darius's apartment had cracked something open in her, had shown her what she'd been missing in her relentless pursuit of achievement and control. Connection. Real connection. The kind that existed without agenda, that asked nothing, and offered everything, that recognized shared humanity beneath the surfaces of race and class and power. The changes she'd implemented at Ashford Capital weren't just about better business practices or risk management, though they were certainly about those things. They were about creating an environment where people like Darius didn't have to choose between integrity and survival, where excellence was recognized regardless of who demonstrated it, where the playing field was level enough that talent could actually matter. It was slow work, frustrating work that faced resistance from people invested in old systems and comfortable inequities. But it was work worth doing, work that meant something beyond quarterly earnings and stock prices. Her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant, a reminder about tomorrow's early meeting. Victoria glanced at the time, realized she'd been working far later than intended, gathered her things to leave. But before she did, she looked once more at the photograph of the mug, at the marshmallows frozen in their state of almost melted perfection, at the evidence of a moment when everything had seemed impossible, but help had come from an unexpected direction. She touched the frame lightly, a gesture of gratitude or remembrance or hope. Then she turned off her office lights and headed home to an apartment that was still too large, still too quiet, but somehow felt less empty than it had before. In his apartment in East Baltimore, Darius helped Zoe get ready for bed, the routine familiar and comforting. Teeth-brushed pajamas on stuffed rabbit retrieved from wherever it had ended up during the day's adventures. He read her a story about a girl who befriended a dragon, Zoe, providing commentary about what the characters should do differently, her narrative instincts already well developed. When the story finished, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Daddy, do you think the sad lady is happy? Now I think she's happier. I think she's still working on it like all of us. That's good. Everyone should get to be happy." The simplicity of her worldview was both beautiful and heartbreaking. He kissed her forehead, turned off the light, left her door slightly ajar the way she liked it. Back in the kitchen, he made himself tea, the same kind he'd made for Victoria that night, though he didn't consciously realize the connection until the kettle whistled. He sat at the table where they'd shared breakfast, where Zoe had dispensed wisdom disguised as hot chocolate instructions, where decisions had been made that changed the trajectory of multiple lives. The rain would come again, he knew, Storms, where inevitable challenges would continue appearing. The world would keep testing his principles and his patience. But some boundaries had held through the worst of it. Some dignity had survived intact. Some people had chosen to stand when it would have been easier to kneel. And in the space between what was and what might be there was room for something like hope. Not naive optimism, not blind faith that everything would work out perfectly, but a grounded belief that effort mattered, that choices accumulated into something meaningful, that building a better world was possible, even if the progress came slowly. He finished his tea and rinsed the mug, looking out the kitchen window at the city beyond. Somewhere out there, Victoria was probably still working, probably looking at that photograph of marshmallows, and remembering what it felt like to be seen as human, rather than just powerful. Somewhere out there, people were making their own choices about integrity and compromise, about standing up and bowing down, about what kind of world they wanted to leave behind. And here in this small apartment in East Baltimore, a father and daughter had faced a storm together and remained standing. That was worth everything.